Hi, this is Joe Hage. I have the pleasure of leading your medical devices group. As of this recording, we have over 270,000 members worldwide. And I believe that one of the reasons that our group continues to grow is we have folks like Tom Kramer, who is on the Medical Devices Group Advisory Board. He's pretty much my go-to for design and development questions. And actually, through Tom, I'm meeting Mark Schwartz. He is the CEO of PDT Group, Design Group, and they have prepared a rich hour for us. I will hand it over to you, Tom, and I am putting myself on mute, but I'll be around, and have a great webinar. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. Thank you for everyone for attending across the globe. Nice to have you all here. I'm Tom Kramer, as Joe said, President and CEO of Kablooey Design. We're here in not-so-sunny Minneapolis, where we're getting about 4 inches of nice, fluffy snow, which is apropos for this time of the year. Just a quick word about who I am and where I'm from. So I'm with Kablooey Design. Kablooey Design is a Minneapolis-based product development company. We invent, design, and engineer all kinds of medical devices, mostly, as well as other things, through everything from research to ideation, design, engineering, prototyping, and technology transfer to production for all kinds of these devices. So we have fun in that sense of the word, being design engineers that enjoy creating new things that help improve people's lives. Mark, if you want to chime in and give a little bit about your background, that would be great.
Sure, thanks. I'm Mark Schwartz. I'm founder of PDT. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary a couple of days ago, so it's kind of exciting. We're a product development firm located in Chicago, and we have some other offices around the world. And we're about 100, or a little better than 100, engineers and designers doing research, engineering, etc. We work in a number of industries, including about 50% of our businesses in medical devices.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. So to dive right into what we're doing, our webinar today is designing health for consumers, and we're looking at some of the trends. And just to kick off, one of the main points that we're looking at here is that vital tracking, consumers are able to do a ton of vital tracking right now, and this convergence of consumer vital tracking and clinical grade devices is coming. And the big questions for today's webinar are, how do we approach that as design engineers, as developers, as medical device people? How are we going to approach that, and what are the implications for us? We see people like Apple coming out with devices like this that are focused on all kinds of sensing, as well as Samsung's SIM-band. The advancement in sensors has been huge, and the ability to shrink things and have batteries that last longer is driving a lot of this. So it's an exciting time, and there's a lot of exciting devices that are being launched. And sometimes it's a glut of devices just wondering, what can be used, how should it be used, what kind of patient should be using what. But right now, home health care has been driving this trend, home health care and patient empowerment. So we've got a rising number of patients being treated at home, and there's a lot of reasons for this, everything from the aging of the baby boomers to legislation that's happening in different countries around the world, including the U.S., that drive the different ways that we pay for health care, and that is vastly increasing the amount of health care that's happening in the home instead of the clinic. So that trend is definitely on the upswing. So the question is, how do we do all this? How do we converge the vital tracking that we're seeing in clinical or in consumer level devices? How do we converge it to meet the needs of our clinical world and communicate with our primary care physicians, caregivers, patients themselves? How do we do it? We'd love for it to all be a perfect communication line right now and have futuristic things like this happening. That's not happening now. It could be in the future, but in the meantime, what do we do to develop our devices to get there and make it work so it's efficient, cost-effective, and safe? So I wanted to share some issues to take a look at and tackle first. So I'm going to go through some issues that I think we should be aware of. Those of you out there that are developers, designers, engineers that are involved in technology, thinking about how to make new devices, I just want to share some things that we should be aware of, that we should think about, that we should use in our development process. And then Mark is going to attack some specific things about how we would do things such as mobile apps and how mobile apps play in, and how do you design something for a mobile app, and what do you have to pay attention to when you're doing mobile apps. So some issues to tackle here. First of all, there's the health information and security issues, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those. Those are pretty obvious. Being able to have security and confidentiality to health records, there's a lot going on there, and it's a lot of secure transmission. And Mark can actually attack some of that a little bit later. But what I want to focus on is a little bit more of the design engineering issues. And one of the big ones is making the devices simplified for the patient, but sophisticated enough for caregivers. This is a dichotomy that we really have to pay attention to as product developers. And one of the things we have to realize while we're doing this type of development work is that a huge part of our population is the elderly or the over 65 at home. Obviously, we've seen these kinds of devices, these sensing devices, these mobile devices, in the fitness world up to this point, and that's because nobody was attacking the medical world with it. So in fitness, it's a completely different demographic. But the fitness market, I believe, is dwarfed by the market that we're really trying to attack when we get to medical, and that's the elderly at home. So we have to think about how can they interact with these devices and understand how to use a device and how to work it, and what's their dexterity like? What are their hands like? What are their fingers like? What is their thinking like? And how can we make it workable for them, yet still have the technology in it that our caregivers and our clinicians and our clinics would need? That's a big issue to pay attention to. Another issue is the idea of the manpower to screen data and who gets alerted when. So many of these devices, like we've seen with Fitbits and fuel bands and Scanadus and all kinds of other things, the sensor technology is wonderful, and we're sensing all of this data. And the one thing that we have to be aware of is we can't be naive enough to think that there's going to be teams of receptionists or operators standing by in back rooms somewhere that are just going to be receiving all of this data and then filtering it to send it to the right people. Right now, there are not rooms filled with teams of people just waiting to get massive amounts of data from individual people all over the world and then getting it to the right places. Those teams may be built in the future, but right now it's not there. The money isn't there for it. So we have to think about that as we're designing and developing these devices. What data are we going to capture? What's important to capture? Who are we sending it to, and how are we sending it to them? And I know Mark will address some of that as we get down the line here. Another issue to really pay attention to as engineers and developers is the overwhelming of the physician. Kind of related to the last one, studies have shown lately that physicians have, on average, they spend about 8 to 12 minutes with each patient each day. So they've got precious little time, and it's not because they're necessarily eating bonbons or relaxing or reading books the rest of their time. Their day is packed full of patients, and they've got tons of paperwork they have to do, and they've only got 8 to 12 minutes to spend per patient. So we have to realize that if we're going to empower patients to capture a massive amount of data with sensors and body-worn sense devices, that we're not going to be sending all of that data right to their primary care physician. I mean, they only have the 8 minutes per day to spend with them. So if we're going to ask them to send hours of data that has to be analyzed, it's just not realistic. So again, what data do we capture? Who do we send it to, and how do we send it there? A related issue is, again, we're dealing with high-risk seniors. That's a big part of our market here as we're designing devices to go into the home, devices to be worn on the body or close to the body. A big part of this population is high-risk seniors. And currently in the U.S., and it may be similar in other countries, but right now the trend for spending time for nurses and caregivers to spend time with these patients is actually going down. So we have more and more patients that are in the home, but nurses have less and less time to spend with them. A lot of our legislation here with the creation of accountable care organizations has kind of led to this phenomenon where nurses aren't being paid by the hour to visit these patients like they used to be. They're being paid per patient, so consequently they're having to spend less time with each patient and pack more patients into their day as they see them. So as design engineers, we have to understand what the competency level of our users are. It may not be a nurse anymore. It may be just a standard daily caregiver who is trained to a lower level, maybe paid at a lower level, or it may be the patient themselves. Another issue that we have to really take a close look at is, apps are cheap, but devices can be expensive. So, Mark will be taking a look at different ways that we use smartphones with devices, and it's quick and easy to have an app, but what about when now we have complicated sensors and these sensors have to go into devices? And in the past, many of these devices have been expensive, and we haven't had access to some of the high-quality sensors that we need to do the high-quality sensing that medical data would require. So that's changing. As these sensors are developed in higher and higher quantities down the road, we'll have access to higher quality sensors. But traditionally, lower quality sensors give you lower quality results, which might be fine for fitness, but doesn't work so well when you're talking about the medical world and potential life-saving situations and people's health. So again, a dichotomy there that we really have to pay attention to as designers and developers. And then another issue is what is the information format we're going to do? And Mark's going to really open this up and shed some light on what are some of the best ways to go about this. But we just have to be cognizant up front if we're going to choose what information format we're going to choose and who we're sending it to. And again, if our recipients and our demographic is a senior population, I know with my parents, they run on a Macintosh, and if they have something, they run into this all the time, and I get the phone call, this isn't working on my Mac, what's wrong, and I have to show them how to download an attachment from an email because they don't understand it. So, we have to understand the level of information accessibility that our users will have and the ability for them to function well and actually manage their health and do it. It's just something that we really have to pay attention to. And then the last issue that I wanted to share that we really have to be cognizant of and pay attention to is being able to make the device usable and well understood by this senior population. So again, I go to this population because I believe it is the biggest population coming up for what we're talking about here, which is wearable devices, sensors, devices that are going to talk to smartphones. And we have to pay attention to this inverse rule. And this inverse rule is the more likely that you are to need a technology, the less likely you are to be savvy with it. So how do we make it, how do we use this technology, but make it so my parents can use it and understand it, but especially without making mistakes. Because if it's just for them seeing their heart rate when they're on the treadmill, that's one thing. But if it's for some very important data that has to do with their health, it's a different story. So how do we do that? And that's something we have to think about going into it as designers. So it really makes us think about changing the way we think about design. Instead of thinking about going into design with, hey, there's this great technology, how can we fit it into a device? We have to sort of reverse that and say, what is it that our users need? And what technologies out there are going to help our users meet their needs? It's kind of a different way of thinking. It's a design thinking way of approaching the design and the engineering process. But it's very important in this world of devices. So here's a slide I wanted to share with you. I'm not going to go through all of this for sake of time, but for those of you that are going to download the presentation, this is a great slide that Deloitte University put together. Just some things to think about and focus on as you're leaping into the process of developing a wearable sensor technology. And the areas I'm talking about here are great. You know, your content, your communication, how you're influencing the patient, the interaction you expect that person to have with it, the intelligence behind it, the intention, how it enhances things, and what network you're going to use. These are just great rules of thumb. I encourage you to print this out and just keep this with you in your design resource book. So one of the interesting things is, and one of the importance of what we're talking about here today is if we don't address this need with our innovative design solutions, patients are going to use their consumer level devices to track their vitals and do self-diagnosis. And we've seen this obviously over the last several decades of people being able to self-diagnose through things like WebMD and to go online and do online self-diagnosing, which has been great. But there's also some problems and issues we have to be aware of when we see patients doing that. Now, that going online and diagnosing yourself is a symptom-based way of diagnosing, which is great. You go online and you look at your symptoms. But some of the problems with that are shown in this chart here. There was a study that was done that shows if you go online, and what this is showing here is, say you go online with a symptom, a headache or muscle twitches or chest pain. If you're doing a web search and you're going online to do this, you are likely to feel like you have a 26% chance of having a brain tumor because you have a headache, or a 50% chance of having ALS if you have muscle twitches, or almost 1/3 chance of having a heart attack if you're experiencing chest pain, when in reality those diagnoses are minuscule compared to indigestion or caffeine or muscle strain. But users don't necessarily understand the tool that they're using to diagnose themselves. So most users don't understand the mathematical models and the algorithms that are being used on a web search, and they could easily come up with a bad diagnosis. The problem with this is large because, for example, people could go on here and assume that they have a brain tumor based on the fact that it looks like they've got a 26% chance of having that brain tumor, and it may lead someone to dabble with using different drugs or even get into drug abuse in order to make the pain fade away because they're facing some sort of terminal illness. And that may lead them to think they don't have long to live, so they're not so concerned about an addiction as they are quality of life. And they might feel like there's no reason to be sober, so who cares about the addiction? But if their pain really came due to allergies and they don't get that addressed, those allergic symptoms could increase and grow much more severe, could change to asthma, and at some point they could have an addiction to drugs and have asthma and still have the headache. So these are some issues that people face with self-diagnosis, and just understanding the technology that they're using to diagnose it, just a misunderstanding of that could be a huge issue for them. One of the issues is here's a study that was done that shows a large number of people are doing this self-diagnosis, but half of them never talk to their doctor about it afterwards. So they go through the self-diagnosis. They believe they've got a really good diagnosis, and they don't go to their doctor. So if they do fall into some of these issues where it's being diagnosed wrong, they're never getting a professional to take a look at it. There are some really good sites out there. Here's one, the Mayo Clinic has a great symptom checker site, but it's all geared towards getting to a healthcare professional at the end. So if you don't do that, and 63% of the people believe they're getting a complete, accurate diagnosis, when in reality there might be things going wrong that lead into the wrong diagnosis, that could be a problem. So it's been a problem with web self-diagnosis, but what we're talking about here is different. We're talking about sensors and technology, which is a data-driven diagnosis, not a symptom-based diagnosis. But we face similar concerns and similar issues. So there's pros and cons to doing this, and obviously one of the cons we talked about is overdiagnosis can use to a flooding of the system. And we've seen we can't be flooding. There just isn't the ability to flood your healthcare provider, your nurses, with information. The great thing about it, though, is self-diagnosing can be proactive and it can be preventative, and that's the whole purpose behind being able to use sensors yourself as a patient and do some self-diagnosis. We're trying to empower the patient to be preventative, and that's being preventative, of course, will save the healthcare system time and lots of money. So some of the issues with this, now here's the Scanadu device, and most of you are probably familiar with this device, but this is a brand new device out there that's for self-scanning. And, we see some of the chatter going on. I just captured some of the chatter that, we have engineers out there saying that these devices can be useful, but only if, of course, the results are accurate. So accuracy was a big, big thing with devices like this. And then we see a quote there from the CEO of Xanadu saying that they did have accuracy problems when they first got the device out there. And the initial tests had a persistent problem, and they had to go back and go back. And for some of the reasons that we talked about, the cost of the proper sensors, it was a hindrance. It was an issue. So again, now going back to why is this important to us as engineers and designers, and why do we have to think about this? Well, here's 3 big focal points for addressing these kinds of issues. And one of them is the accuracy of the sensors. And again, we talked about that, and Mark will talk about this a little bit too, but sensors obviously get more and more expensive as they get more accurate, and time has to go by before that changes. But the second thing is the difficulty of the sensor placement or poor sensor placement. So this speaks to where do we put the sensor on the device, but also how does the device enable the user to put the sensor in contact with their body? That's a huge, huge issue. And of course, user error too. Does the user understand how to use it so the sensor is working? Great example of this is in the 1990s, there was a company that had a patent on a device that used a pulse oximeter to measure your oxygen saturation, and then they connected that to oxygen delivery for people who needed oxygen delivery in their home. This way they would get smart oxygen delivery. Well, the company went bankrupt. For one, nobody wanted it at the time because nobody would pay for a more expensive oxygen delivery device. Well, now times have changed, and hospitals are more interested in paying for devices that will keep patients from being readmitted. So the device got new legs again. However, the little devices, the devices that we use currently to sense your oxygen saturation, your pulse oximeters, were designed for people to sit still and put on your fingertip. Well, if you're going to be sensing someone's oxygen as they're ambulatory and moving around, having something hanging from your fingertip is probably not realistic. So we wanted to go to ear-placed oxygen sensing devices. Well, the sensors in the ear ones were of lower quality, so that became a problem. If you can't get quality sensing, your device is not going to perform the way it needs to perform. So now those devices over the years have become more and more accurate, but they're still very expensive. And so we're running into this problem of how do we make it affordable and still as effective as we want it to be. So that's just one of those issues. So as we go through and we think about how we're planning on developing these devices, we have to also understand that it's a very complex situation. This dichotomy between clinicians, the clinics, the physicians, the technicians, the nurses, and the whole manufacturing side of the business, it's a complex issue. As we see, manufacturers, we're developing more expensive, higher tech connected devices. And our hope is that hospitals will pay more for these devices to keep them from coming back in 30 days, as we saw in the example that I just gave of the oxygen sensing device. However, clinicians will be spending, they will want to be spending less on devices because reimbursement is very difficult to get that to go up. So if we have a more expensive device, they may not be getting reimbursed for that. So they're going to want to be looking towards the cheaper devices, just like in the oxygen device. They were battling devices that already delivered oxygen but just did it poorly. So the hospital has to take a look at, are we willing to spend money to make it a little bit better, and what are the results? And they need clinical data for results before they change their mind. But they're also getting paid less per patient with this population healthcare model. So as they're getting paid less per patient, they have to decide, is this device going to make me spend more time with the patient or less? And that's something that we as developers and designers and engineers have to make sure that when we design a device, it's designed for the healthcare worker to spend less time with the patient, but still get the quality results that they need. As a result, this is going to result in hospitals becoming the buyers of our new devices, that are especially the ones that are related to ACO readmissions, not necessarily the clinicians or the technicians or the physicians of the past. So in the past, oftentimes we as engineers would design a device knowing that the physician will like this better, or this will make the procedure easier for the physician, or it will cause less pain for the patient. And these were some of our major concerns, and they will always be our major concerns. But now we have to look at the hospital and say the hospital purchasing person is actually our buyer now. So how do we design this device to make sure that that hospital purchasing person will actually buy it? Because if they don't, no matter how wonderful we've made the device, it's not going to do anybody any good. So we really have to pay attention to that as our whole political landscape changes and as this relationship between our clinicians and our manufacturers becomes very tenuous. As design engineers, we have to bridge that gap between the two and make sure our devices work for both sides of the equation. Now I'll turn it over to Mark. Mark's going to really dive into some of the specifics with how some of these technologies work and why you would want to use them in certain situations and design them a certain way.
Thanks a lot, Tom, and hello again, everybody. I was fortunate enough to start my career in the 80s at Motorola, so I had a front row seat of the maturation of the cell phone over the years. I also got to see the rise and fall of Motorola, Nokia, RIM, and now we've got Apple and Android leading the world. And I genuinely believe that the reason that Apple and Android generally are so successful is because they're the ones, they were the pioneers in opening up the architecture of the phone. Prior to that, you think back about Nokia, RIM, and Motorola, they were always very guarded about the architecture of the phone and giving you access to some of the data that the phone was producing. Apple changed that paradigm, and lo and behold, you had apps everywhere, which is really a cool thing. What I'm going to do in my portion is I'm going to touch on the 4 different levels as we see them for leveraging a smartphone for medical applications. We're also going to show some other examples that are non-medical. So these are in order of difficulty, by the way. The first one is the simple smartphone app. So we show an example here of a Weight Watchers app. Pretty simple to develop. User interface is extremely important, ease of use. But this allows you to write an app and access some of the sensors like geo-positioning or accelerometers within your phone for free, and then create algorithms to somewhat approximate exercise, for example, and calorie burn. Is it going to be super accurate? Probably not. It's not going to work if you're not wearing your phone, etc. But then these apps also rely heavily on user input. So some of the pros is they're really simple. The user interfaces are simple. They're on a device you're familiar with. They're relatively inexpensive and short lead times to develop them, and typically they're free for the most part. But they are very limited as far as the accuracy of the data. And like I said, they often rely on the honesty of the person putting inputs in, and if you're counting calories, putting in the right foods, and etc. So I wouldn't say they're so much medical grade, but they're also very handy and frankly quite motivational. Generally speaking, when you keep statistics, you're motivated, right? Because most people are competitive and they want to outdo themselves. So it is very helpful from that perspective. 2 major players dominate the space. The Android devices and the iPhone devices makes up anywhere from 85 to 95% of the space. I personally had a Windows phone for a while, and I absolutely loved it, but I did give up on it because there's rarely any apps written for it, because everyone's doing Android and Apple only for the most part. One little tip to mention here is that in our experience, we found it's better to develop one of the platforms first in its entirety, and then do the second platform to follow, because it goes much smoother. It's much more efficient. In other words, if you try to do them in parallel, you're going to be debugging things twice and stuff. So generally speaking, a tip would be to do them at the same, one after the other. The second, slightly more complicated, is linking a wireless device to a smartphone. The example here is the Nike Fuel Band. So this is cool stuff. It's a wearable device. It's wirelessly attached to the phone. It can leverage the phone for things like setup, but then complements the phone by adding a whole new set of sensors that are strategically located on the body to perform various tasks to feed data back wirelessly to the phone. Typically these are Bluetooth, and something to note about that is by virtue of being wireless, one of the disadvantages, you're supporting 2 batteries, 2 devices. That could be kind of a hassle. And there are some limitations in bandwidth with things like Bluetooth. Here's another example of a device that does a very specific thing. This actually sniffs your skin to see if you've been drinking any alcohol. So Lindsay Lohan actually made this famous. In fact, she used to paint it with nail polish to kind of disguise it, because it actually has a secure band on it, so it's tamper-proof. So if you're lucky enough to get assigned one of these, you're stuck with it. What it does is it has a proprietary sensor in it. It actually runs a pump that constantly sniffs your skin, and it can actually sense if you drink one single beer. If it does sense that, it will send a report through your cell phone to the parole officer, who then, dings you that you're in violation. Again, these systems, they raise the level of compliance to a whole nother level. Think about asking Lindsay Lohan to be on her honor about things, as opposed to a device that actually tracks it and you really have no control over. It does mean that in this case it has to be rugged. You have to be able to take a shower with it. It also, the proprietary sensor, since it's pump-based, is a battery hog, so you do have to bring it in every month and have it taken off, cleaned, and a new sensor and batteries are put in it. So there are some, several cons with this sorts of technologies too. There's also some development challenges. I'm going to say time and time again that architecture is key with any of these devices. Architecture meaning which wireless protocol do you pick, how much bandwidth do you need, how much battery space do you have, how small does it need to be, etc. All that stuff is critical when you're defining the requirements and specifications of devices like this. I've included a handy chart that we won't go through here, but it does talk about the pros and cons of the various wireless protocols that you're given by default with your smartphone, and it also suggests what some of the best applications are. So Bluetooth, ANT, NFC, and Wi-Fi. So please download the presentation and use that. The third is actually where you hardwire or direct connect the piece of hardware to the smartphone. We at PDT affectionately call those accessories. It means it combines an app with a physical accessory. This is not a medical device, it's a military device that we did, but it's fully ruggedized, and it uses an iPhone as the user interface and the screen and partially the brains. The cool thing about doing a direct connect is that it allows you to share battery power. So as long as this device is charged, it can keep the phone charged. You don't have to worry about 2 devices and one wearing out before the other and shutting you down. The other cool thing about this is behind this door, the iPhone becomes rugged for field use. But if you'd like to deploy it in a non-rugged situation, the soldier can deploy the iPhone and control this device remotely if he'd like, which is pretty cool. Ultimately, though, the best part about it all is it's an interface people are comfortable with. It's approachable. They understand it. And you can use it offline as well as a standalone phone and look at your data anytime you'd wish. Now, we could see this really expanding into healthcare relative to cost savings and things, but there are some downsides, of course, as well, particularly the fact that cell phones do change a lot. The hardware changes a lot. When you look at the myriad of different sizes and shapes of phones, you have to be very careful when you're using the shape of the phone to dock. There are clever ways around this. You also have to be careful of the life of the phone versus the life of the device, so that you always know that you can support your device. There's another issue, too, to be careful of. One of the reasons Apple does so well is they make you license through the MFI program or Made for iPhone program. They actually embed a chip in the Lightning connector shown here, which allows Apple to control the fact that you've paid a fee. You basically overpaid for this chip in order to access the Lightning connector. We've actually seen lately iPhone 5 accessories that use the Lightning connector are not working on a lot of iPhone 6 phones now because Apple actually clamped down on that protocol. And so the result of that is I can tell you that this device that PDT developed for a juice pack for your phone, the workaround we have is a little adapter, micro USB to Apple adapter. When the iPhone 6 came out, that little part went from $1 to $3.60 because now they're policing it closer and making sure people are using MFI approved connectors. Here's another chart that talks about the pros and cons again of the various ways that you can hard connect to the phones and what those are, where the best applications are. There's also an interesting workaround here using the headphone jack. There's a company called Square who has done very well, and their workaround was to plug into the audio jack, and they were able to because the data, the small packets of data that they needed to send for the credit cards were able to be passed through the audio jack. And there is a little bit of power that you can draw from the audio jack, although it's very small. So that's an interesting option for precisely the right applications. Certainly not for all. And then the last is the most exciting, I think, is the medical device full-on ecosystem, where the phone is kind of the central hub, and you create an ecosystem of products. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. So here's a great example of a very intelligent, advanced glucose meter that has the ability to check your glucose with a disposable strip, as well as track your diet and some other things that it's sensing. It has a Bluetooth connection to a smartphone, but it also has a Bluetooth connection to an ambulatory infusion pump. So the cool thing about this ecosystem, and again, this becomes complicated. It becomes a Class 2 medical device. It's making decisions about dosing. It's tracking compliance to what you've been told to do for tests. So while this is complicated, it also takes everything to the next level from like I said, a compliance standpoint. And when you're tracking compliance so closely, it's really a win-win-win. It's a win for the provider of the device and the disposable because they get to sell what they're supposed to be selling. It's a win for the patient because they're going to feel better because they're doing what was prescribed and not blowing it off. It's being tracked. They're also going to feel a lot better because by using a device of this level of sophistication, it's constantly monitoring your readings and your health and your diet. So it's giving you shots of drug when you need it and in smaller doses so you don't have the ups and downs of crashes and things. And the device is discreet and wearable, so you're just going to have a better quality of life, frankly. That also makes the health care provider or the insurance company much happier, too, because it allows them to control costs much better. Now you're more responsible for your own care, and it's being tracked that you're doing it properly. It's also great for a family member, too. So let's say that your older parent gets prescribed this device. Since it's using the smartphone to get to the cloud and run through a server, not only the practitioners and the physicians and everything have access to data, I can also have access to my 85-year-old mom and make sure that she's okay and that she's testing and things like that, and that her numbers are in the right zones and stuff. So this is really the future, I think. I think that it creates that win-win-win I was talking about. I think it will help drive down the costs of care. It'll give people better quality of life. I think it's really an important step. But I can't stress enough that the full-on ecosystem type level does require, a fair amount of engineering and software. It requires good research to understand the needs of all the stakeholders, and it also is much more regulated, obviously, in this case, like Class 2. So, like I said, there can be a considerable lead time involved in these types of products, a fair amount of software, a lot of firmware. It also requires you to think about architecture much more thoroughly. So, for example, does it make sense to put the cellular chip in this device, or do you leave it in the cell phone? Most people like to keep the cell phone chip out of the device because it requires another SIM card, which requires another bill, which requires a lot of battery drain and bigger batteries and a bigger device. So we see it being popular to keep the cellular in the phone. But you also have to think about redundancies with servers. You also have to think about redundancies with the wireless protocols. If you say, for example, grandma is in extended care facility with big, thick brick walls and cellular doesn't work well, you may need to have another system where it picks up on Wi-Fi, et cetera. So there are a lot of things to think about in these. Continuing on that thought, I had mentioned generally high costs for development, long development cycle, et cetera. And again, this large diagramming and research and use case scenarios really has to be studied correctly to come out with the right product and put the right technology in the right pieces of the ecosystem. So there's a lot to consider. We think that a lot of it comes from good research and good development of requirements and specifications in order to do the best product, and to do that up front and really think this through before you embark on the larger scale type device. Tom and I will open it up for questions now if anybody has any questions. Thanks for your time.
Thank you both. Actually, yeah, a few questions did come in, and I encourage you to use your chat box there to ask a question. The first one comes from Massachusetts. It's for Mark and I think Tom. You mentioned research. Would you expound on what you mean by research? What kinds of research are we talking about? Thank you.
Sure, I'll take a crack at that one, Tom, and then you can chime in if you'd like. But we think that as the breadth of stakeholders widens in this new healthcare arena, meaning that in the old days all we cared about was what the doctor thought and did he like the product. Nowadays it's much wider. There's the person who makes the buying decision, the person who actually purchases it, the person that maintains it, cleans it, sets it up, the person that uses it, the family member that wants to monitor it. So we believe that it's really important when you're developing requirements for your new device that you do upfront stakeholder research. So, and that would also include voice of the customers and voice of the stakeholders and also voice of the business. So making sure you understand all those people's needs and you turn them into quality requirements so that you get the best product, and that when it does finally get to market, you've done your homework and it is what everyone wants because you've considered everyone's inputs. Tom, you want to talk about that too?
Yeah, excellent. Very well put, Mark. It really shows the importance of doing that research, and I think one thing that is always good to try to focus on is discovering, when you're doing that research, trying to discover what is the weak link in the decision-making chain of purchasing this. So for instance, a patient may not like exactly how it might be too big or a little too clunky, but they might still use it and be uncomfortable with it. But like Mark was saying, if this is being purchased by a hospital and that purchaser isn't going to pay more than 7 cents more than the device they were previously using, and this is $20 more, it doesn't matter if the patient thinks it's too big or if you slim it down and the patient thinks it's really comfortable. That's the link in the chain that will, when it breaks, nothing else matters after that. So that's one of the important things in research, is identifying what are those links in the chain where if they break, nothing else matters. And I think that's one of the things you really try to sift out of that upfront research, because it changes how you design and develop the product. And you don't want to be making those changes down the road after you've launched an alpha unit and a beta unit and you've got a unit in clinical state. You want to make those changes early on while you're still on paper.
Thank you both. My friend Dev has a question. He says, is 510K clearance mandatory for home health care, personal care products?
510 for home health care, personal care products. Well,
I'll say, hey, Deb, if you want to add a little bit of context to your question, I think I can answer that it really is a function of what the product is. If your question is more about apps, I'm going to assume that, Tom. Do apps need 510K clearance? Like
right.
Fitbit, he writes. Does Fitbit need clearance?
Do they need clearance? Does an app need clearance? Well, I'm not a regulatory expert. We should have one of our regulatory advisory board guys on here. Mark, what do you think?
Well, generally speaking, the way we usually look at this is there is an FDA site that's really quite friendly. You have the ability to go onto that site and search around for similar or predicate devices, and what that'll tell you is if you're a Class 1, 2, or a 3. So, for example, even a Band-Aid is a Class 1 medical device. I don't believe apps are regulated now because they don't really drive any decisions per se, but certainly some of the stuff I was showing as it got further down the complexity chain definitely are. And those depend then whether there's a predicate device and you do a standard 510K, or if it's required that you do clinical trials and et cetera. So the whole regulatory thing is an important part of your early stage development, and rendering an opinion and getting that verified relative to what your regulatory requirements are.
Yeah, and without knowing what the app does, it's hard to say, because if you're trying to prove that it's safe and effective, you're probably going to have to get FDA clearance. But if there's nothing about your app that has anything to do with the patient's safety, and if you don't have to prove that the app is making the treatment effective or not effective, it may not even need FDA clearance, so it might not need a 510K. So I think that's what you have to look at, and it just depends on what you're trying to do, really.
We have a comment. You'll have to forgive me if I mispronounce this. Yehonatan, I probably messed that up. But he or she, pardon me, offers that well-being devices do not require FDA approval. However, if it presents HR or any other medical info, heart rate that is, FDA approval is required. So thank you for that. Our next question comes from Tim, who asks, with so many devices all needing to work together, there seems to be a lack of collaboration between companies, resulting in the lack of cohesion inside the hospitals. Hospitals get frustrated as a result. How can we do better to develop solutions to this growing issue?
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent observation. I mean, that is so true, and we see that in the hospitals. If you're going into a hospital and we're developing a new device and we're doing some research, you can see people in the hospital roll their eyes and say, oh, not another screen that I have to look at and pay attention to that just is by itself and talks to itself. The answer would be a complex one. The question is a complex one. But there are groups out there that are trying to unify all this data collection, and Mark, maybe you will know of some too, but I know of a group right here in Minneapolis that is trying to put together a platform that will link all sensing devices or any sensing device that's putting out information in a signal, the health records that hospitals will be using, and data for the reimbursement people and what reimbursement needs. And they're trying to put together a hub, a portal with a software platform that sort of brings all this together. And we may see a kind of a race to find out who is going to end up with the system or the hub that works, just like VHS and Beta and Windows and Apple. I mean, there may be one system that wins out that just people use for all this to come together. But I think it's going to take something like that because everything is disparate and separate right now.
It is true that a very popular term these days is the Internet of Things, and as we see so many devices getting Internet enabled, it actually does have the benefit of commonizing a platform in a sense that devices that may have their own idiosyncrasies and user interfaces and stuff, if they're getting to the Internet, they could be then going to the nurse's iPad that she's carrying around. So in a way, that does consolidate a lot of data, and a person can monitor several devices in a common platform that's friendly. So there is some good things going on in that area, too, to get it a little better consolidated. And we see that across a lot of industries, not just healthcare.
Thank you both. Some more questions coming in. And just a note, I've shared with everyone on the call the link to the slides. And Mark and Tom, up to you, but you can send a note to the audience, perhaps if you want to give your email address if people want to contact you after the presentation. Pamela asks, what do you think about the amount of information a patient can get from those devices? For sure, people feel comfortable staying at home, but what about the interaction between the doctor and the patient?
Well, that's an issue that we were discussing as we went through. How much information can you get, and how much do you want to gather? How much do you want to give to your physician? How much is for the patient? And it's tough if you can't get an accurate result, or if your patient has trouble using it and the sensor isn't staying in good contact with the skin and you're not getting a good reading. You don't want that patient becoming distraught and then sharing that information with the physician when he just maybe wasn't wearing it correctly. I mean, that's something that the caregiver or the nurse should be addressing. So that information should go to them. So I don't know, it's hard to answer that. What was the nature of the question, Joe? Were they asking how to share that information?
I think it was more of an observation about there may be plenty of information, but at what point do patient and doctor come back together to talk about a plan?
Yeah, that goes back to the 8 minutes that the doctor has to spend with a patient. So if you went to the clinic and saw your doctor yesterday and he spent 8 minutes with you, and then tomorrow you were wearing one of your devices and you saw something that alarmed you, that's a good question. Do you set up another appointment? Do you send him a text? Do you expect him to read every patient's texts all day long? I mean, this is really a problem that needs to be addressed. And I don't know if there's a good answer. It's just, for now, we know that we just have to be aware that we certainly can't expect every patient to be texting their doctor 5 times a day. There's no way the doctor can sift through that much information.
It's actually the subject of today's medical device group discussion about chronic care. Tom, you were with me last year at 10X. You'll recall when IBM's Stephen Pierce talked about this. So in a moment's time, I'll ferret out that link and share it with the group. Gary asks the next question. Do you have any thoughts on product development based on platforms for use in consumer devices, such as self-administration, self-injection devices?
Self-administration, self-injection, and which platform, Android or Apple, would be more useful? Is that what he's asking?
Gary, you can type in for clarification. Let's table that for just a moment. And John asks, which organizations do you work with to test the efficacy of your products? Do you work with hospitals, universities?
Oh.
How do you both make sure that the products that you're designing are efficacious?
Well, the efficacy culminates in the clinical trial. So in the clinical trial, you're in, well, it depends on what your device is, but if it's a hospital device, you're in hospitals. If it's a clinical device, you're in clinics. If it's a home device, you may be working with a home care agency to bring your device into homes and to use it there and then test it. So that ultimate efficacy from that testing is done in those places. Prior to that, when you're doing your more formative type studies, the level of efficacy you're getting gets simpler and simpler groups the earlier you get in the development process. So early on, we're doing bench tests in the lab, and we're finding out how efficacious it is, and we're trying it on ourselves, and things like that to a degree. And then we move into having volunteers come into our lab, things like that. So it moves down the line until you get volunteers that you can show it to and get feedback from, and you can test it and see if they understand the results and they know what to do with it. And those can happen through little research formative studies that we have along the way. So the answer is all of those places, obviously depending on what it is. But the universities here in our local area in Minnesota, we are able to do some of that with the University of Minnesota and some other local universities that we work with. I don't know, Mark, is it different for you there?
I would just chime in that as much as we sometimes curse the FDA, I suppose, when they're in our shorts, I suppose, you have to appreciate that the process works, and the fact that you go through you establish a V&V plan, you go through a feasibility stage, which isn't under design control, you create proof of concepts, you test them, you switch over to the next stage where you get into formal design, and you're under design control, and you have to do verification and validation against initial requirements, and you're keeping a design history file, you're tracking hazards and risks. I think the process that the FDA has for us and forces us to use is a healthy one, and I think it works really well. It's different from a case-on-case basis, but I really think it works very well.
Thank you. We are at the top of the hour, and if you're okay staying on a little bit longer, I am. You have a few more questions here. For those of you who need to drop off, we thank you for joining us. We are going to continue recording, and I will send out a link later today with the replay, and I've already shared the slides link. So back to Gary's question. He wasn't talking about Apple or Android. He was talking about for self-administration, self-injection devices. He was talking about electromechanical design. Have you thought about how platforms can be developed and used in this context?
Yeah, so I think for drug delivery systems, right, they're an excellent candidate for this notion of an ecosystem. So if you're infusing some sort of a drug through an electromechanical process or whatever, that's the perfect kind of device where you probably want to keep it small, you're focused on pain, ease of use, compliance. So it's very similar to what I had shown, where you keep that device as small as possible with smaller batteries, with with a simple wireless protocol that then uses your cell phone strategically for user setup and monitoring, and that being a hub to the cloud or whatever. So I think that's that's exactly where you want to lay out an intelligent architecture, as opposed to, for example, saying, wow, I'm going to put Wi-Fi in this device, and then it's only going to upload stuff when it happens to be on a valid Wi-Fi wireless connection, or you know what, I'm going to assume that the user always has their smartphone next to them when they're using this. So yes, I'm just going to simply use Bluetooth, and I'm going to use the phone for these things, and move that technology to this appropriate place and not do it over again. So as I stressed architecture throughout my whole thing, I think that's exactly what I was talking about.
I would agree too. I think the ecosystem where it's, you know, the smart device is incorporated into the electromechanical platform, and they're all working together for something as critical as continuous drug delivery, you know, something like that. You can't have the reliability issues of a wireless, you know, and something going wrong.
The next question comes from Jan. For medical grade devices, what do you think about the necessary infrastructure? Configuring and delivering the devices, monitoring their integrity, reacting to generated alarms, etc. In my opinion, setting the organizational structure is a major hurdle.
The organizational, it sounds like, if I'm interpreting that correctly, it sounds like she's talking about the occurrence of events, of what happens, that some sensing occurs, it generates some information, that information is interpreted. Does that sound like what she's asking there?
Yes, I believe she's talking about the way to take the data and make it insightful so that it helps the patient. There are a lot of obstacles, and what, if anything, from a product design standpoint, can you or Mark talk about to help alleviate that strain?
Well, you know, one of the things that I've seen in some studies that have come out lately is one of the big benefits of using these kinds of things for patient healthcare is just the idea of getting them to adhere to a regimen. So for some of these devices, we may not want to be focusing on having a sensor show them, you know, every time their oxygen drops below this, or every time their heartbeat has a little tiny, you know, that might not be the important thing. The important thing might be just giving them a way of continually being aware of what's happening to their body, what's happening to their health, and giving them a way to interact with it. It's kind of the accountability factor that they're talking about. Is if you make patients accountable and you give them a means to be accountable by seeing things that were otherwise invisible to them, that can just help them stay on top of their regimen. So you might want to, you know, set it up in a way where we're giving them just enough information to make sure they're knowing what's going on. But the important things, if you know they have a heart condition and they hit a certain level, and that's the real important thing, then you give them that information. So developing a smart algorithm to deliver the information that they need based on, you know, the disease state that they have, I think that's an important design consideration, but I think that can be done. Because I think the point Jan's making, and it's a very good one, is we don't want to just be giving them tons of all this data and expecting the patient to even know or want to know what to do with all of it. But we can give them enough to be effective at managing their care.
Jan adds, my question is, who is configuring the device? A nurse, a computer guy, the patient, who?
Yeah, so I think that's how I read the question. I believe that, you know, if you take the analogy of you find out you're diabetic and you're being given a glucose meter for the first time, there is a nurse that trains you for the first time, helps you set up the device, teaches you how to use it, and then when you go away and you start using it and get confused and things, then there's hotlines and stuff that you call. I think with these types of devices, it'll be a lot easier for when the device is connected and when the device is going to the cloud, instead of it just being a dumb autonomous device like I just explained. Once it's connected, that nurse that trained is going to be able to see that they're doing it correctly remotely. You're going to be able to have more, be able to push more tutorials and things like that when people forgot because they were nervous. They just found out they have this diabetes and they threw this meter at them and they weren't paying close enough attention because they're upset and things like that. So I believe that what we all see with our smartphones now, I mean, back in my travels, there was huge user manuals for cell phones, and you actually had to use them. And nowadays, nobody looks up anything anymore. You can kind of figure it out. So I think the user interfaces have gotten so good, the screens have gotten so good. As long as you can make the user interface that common thing that you're using every day anyway, I think the chances of success and ease of use and user satisfaction are just that much higher.
I agree.
Dipankar makes these.
Configuring the device.
Go ahead. Well, I thought you had concluded. I was reading the next question.
Oh, I was just going to add to what Mark was saying.
Please.
Jan was asking how to, who configures it. So on one level, configuring the interface, I agree with Mark 100%. It's easier to set. The device can sense maybe you did something wrong because it was configured incorrectly, and it could send a message saying, "Oops, you didn't, have this turned on, and send that to you." And that's one of the wonderful things. Configuring even a little bit deeper, like when the device is developed and designed and engineered, and we have to configure how information is being presented. That has to happen with the collaboration of all the people in that research phase that we were alluding to earlier. You have to talk with the nurse, the technician, the clinician, the patient, the dietitian, the physician, and you have to find out what is important to all of those stakeholders. So when you configure it, then we're making sure that the right information is coming up and getting used.
Just a few comments from Dipankar. This is a few moments ago, that he's letting us know that FDA is welcoming a dialogue about the development phase of how to overcome the obstructions to fluid information coming from these devices, and adds that apps or devices that pass through data without rendering diagnosis will not require a 510K. So thank you for sharing that. David asks, the development cycle for the devices can be 24 months or longer. How do you manage the evolution of the interface, the smartphone, while you are developing the device and trying to validate your application? Great question, David.
Well, what we've done in the past, and Mark, maybe you've done similar things, is we go with a bare bones interface as we're getting through it, just enough to work and to give us the data that we need through testing. And then as we get, but all the time knowing what we need and discovering what it needs to be. And then as we get closer to the end, finalize it at the end. So we've designed that user interface with the most up-to-date, latest technology and look and feel that we can.
Yeah, I think from beware when you do the hard connect to the phone, the accessory that we talked about. That's really tricky. But I think on the software side, I think maintaining upgrades of software from, say, an Apple 5 to an Apple 6, et cetera, or Samsung, that's relatively clean and relatively easy. We don't see the devices these days are quite stable, and we don't see functionality going away. We just see additional functionality. So normally you're going to get good upwards compatibility while you still need to do some upgrades and account for new screen sizes and resolutions and things, generally speaking, that's relatively smooth to support, I think. So having said that, I mean, you have to move your development along with what the latest and greatest thing you have is, and you know, a lot of these have evaluation kits or things that you can leverage. And Android's been pretty, even though it's free, license free, there's not a whole lot of support necessarily, but they've been very consistent with the releases, and there's a lot of support blogs out there and stuff if you do get into issues when a new rev comes out. You can get good support.
Nicholas asks, are there currently any fully integrated single diagnostic platforms that are consumer-focused, eliminating the need for individual separate disease conditions?
Boy, not that I know of. I know there's handfuls of them being developed right now that are for several, you know, sensing or actual diagnostic devices that, you know, can take a sample, whether it be blood or saliva or urine, and you can do an assay and test for several different things. I know that's out there, but I haven't seen anything that's kind of the holistic thing that Nicholas is describing. I don't know. Have you seen anything out there, Mark?
No, I mean, the place to roam around is the AACC conference for that question, which is coming up here in June in Atlanta, I believe. But that's where stuff like that is launched. But what we are seeing is we are seeing much more point-of-care testing being done. So you don't have to send it out to a lab necessarily. A lot of the stuff may not make it into the home necessarily, but it is at least in the doctor's office now. So you do get quick feedback on tests, which I think is the next step. I don't think it's gone all the way yet, though.
Seems as though you guys have hit on a couple of chords here for questions to still be coming in 75 minutes into the presentation. Scott writes, from what I've understood, the specialization gained from a unique standalone device provides the greatest data from sensors for diseases or the conditions tracked. His question is, how does a user deal with the overload of having multiple devices?
Yeah, that's definitely an issue. And in the case of the glucose meter that I showed, the one unit that the user really didn't have to worry about was the pump. So there can be, you know, when they're designed really well, the user can only be exposed to just need-to-know basis stuff and not have to be some expert in all these different complicated devices. It all boils down to the user interface and great design, honestly.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, when you're managing care like that, and you happen to get some sort of a condition, I mean, I think most people feel blessed that they've been given an opportunity to manage it themselves and not have to go to the doctor all the time. So I think there's sort of like a, I'm okay with it because I'm controlling it, and I can manage it myself, and I have freedom. So while it does stink to have a pile of pieces of electronics, perhaps, I think the benefits far outweigh the downside of it.
Yeah, and it's getting there. It's similar to the same problem of all of the drugs that one single patient might be on. You know, and there's patients are on many drugs for many different things at the same time. And when it comes to devices, you know, the only solution is the silver jumpsuit that we'll all wear in the future that we saw in our sci-fi movies years ago. Because, you know, you'll need to sense breath and, you know, oxygen saturation and sweat all at the same time. So, you know, to have one device be sensing everything is impossible right now. But as sensor technology gets better in the future, those things will, continue to become one. I mean, at one point we all had to have a separate digital camera and a separate phone, and and pagers, and all of these things, and a PDA, and now they've all converged into one. And over time, as sensor technology increases, I think we'll see some of that convergence.
We just saw too the latest Samsung phone has a heart monitor in it now, so they'll keep adding functionality to the cell phones, and now these watches are going to come out, and they're going to start, since they're body worn now, they're going to enhance and take on more measurement for us. So it will, exactly what Tom said, boy, you think about all the stuff you used to have to carry around. Think about your CD player with goofy batteries and stuff, carrying that stuff around. It's all gone. So
yeah.
I'm going to squeeze in two more questions. Pamela asks, are 3D printed personalized devices ready to be incorporated in the medical device ecosystem?
Oh, yeah, on some levels, yes, for sure. I mean, we see some out there right now. We're dealing with one here that is just simply a pediatric device for these children that are born with this inability to move their arms. And, they're 3D printing these little exoskeleton things that work with rubber bands for these children. And, that's a simple medical device. Now, it's not electronic in nature, but it very well could have an interface, an electronic component put in. I think right now there's plenty of applications right at this moment for 3D printed personalized devices to be utilized that way.
And let's wrap up with Dipankar, who writes, can you suggest some online focus groups to get feedback on a product we're trying to develop as a startup?
Well, I'd say one of the ultimate online opinion getters is either Kickstarter or Indiegogo. I mean, if you do a Kickstarter campaign and you get funded, people like it, that's for sure.
I might have missed the nature of the question. Was he looking for funding online, or was he looking for feedback?
Feedback, focus groups.
Feedback. Well, you're right. I mean, those are great ways to get feedback.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can tell you that we mentioned research earlier. These days, more people do qualitative research, not quantitative. So there's a lot less focus groups and stuff going on these days, as there's a lot more of the qualitative kind where you're talking to stakeholders and stuff.
Right. And I think
I threw out there Kickstarter and Indiegogo too, because it's a great way to validate a product. It really is. And we've seen a lot of medical device-oriented things get launched on there, and some of them go wild. I mean, there was the Generation 2 watch that just came out, raised $9 million in the first day.
Yeah, and I would say too, there's another group out there called MedStarter, which is just a smaller, lower-grade version of Kickstarter for medical devices. That'd be another good one. And then I'd suggest leveraging the power of the LinkedIn network and utilizing this group or other groups, depending on what his device is. We've done that before too. Reached out to a group that a device was specific for, and in that group asked if there was people who would be interested in giving feedback on it, and then you reach out to that group of people and you get some really, really good feedback.
Well, let's leave it there. I will thank our presenters, Tom Kramer from Kablooey and Mark Schwartz from PDT. Great presentation. I've already got a few emails telling me so I know it's true. And I will have the video, slides, and transcript available online shortly. Thank you all for joining us.